everybody, it's Matt the Dice Checker from Literary Gamers coming to you with something a little different. Now, Mondays I usually do my book reviews, but I'm in the middle of reading stuff that I would like to review that I haven't finished reading yet. So I'm going to spend a few weeks and get my cache of books set and ready to go for review. And I'm going to talk about the ideas behind the different types of genre fiction. Genre fiction tends to be a word that sticks out when you're looking at books, and especially if you're a writer yourself and you're looking to get published. There's a lot of people out there that'll be like, do not submit genre fiction. And I wanted to really explore what that means. So today we are going to look at the first genre, really the genre that got me started into reading more of my adult life. And that is going to be historical fiction. Now, historical fiction exists in two possible ways. I've read quite a bit of it, and there are, like I said, two different ways you can handle historical fiction. One, and I'm using his son's book, but both father and son, Jeff Shera and Michael Shera, the way that they handle historical fiction is they use real-life characters and the real-life historical scenarios around them to create a compelling narrative that pushes the story forward. Now, first off, as a side note, if you haven't read the Civil War trilogy by Jeff Shera and then the Western Theater Civil War books, I highly recommend them, especially Michael Shera's Killer Angels. It basically turns the Battle of Gettysburg into almost like a Shakespearean drama. And Gods and Generals really elongates the characters that are in there. You still have Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in here. You have Winfield Scott Hancock. Why did I call him William? And then you have people on the Confederate side of this as well. Now, when you look at the film, Gods and Generals, the film is more of a biopic on the historical figure Stonewall Jackson. And because of that, sometimes falls into some narrative issues and choice issues. I could spend all day talking about the issues of the Gods and Generals film, mainly that it comes off as Confederate propaganda. I can't say the same for the book. The book is very even. So if you haven't had a chance to read the Civil War trilogy, and then of course the Western series as well by the Sheras, definitely give it a shot, especially Killer Angels. But this is what I would consider the first type of historical fiction to be. Historical fiction that uses real characters to create a narrative that compels you enough to get through the whole book. Then, there's the other way of doing things. Now, I don't have the first book with me because I'm letting somebody borrow it. But everything this author has done is going to follow what I'm about to describe. And that is, this is the second book in Bernard Cornwell's Saxon Tales. For those people who have Netflix, The Last Kingdom. These are the books that The Last Kingdom is based on. It even has the little sticker down there. So what Bernard Cornwell has done throughout his whole career is he's created a character or characters that don't exist in history. It is possible that they could have, that they are the archetype of an individual through history, and they are living through these historic events as kind of like a third person. In fact, at the same time I was reading the Shera Civil War books, I was also reading the Nathaniel Starbuck Civil War books as well. I don't know if Cornwell has ever finished those, but here's hoping to something like that in the near future. So I've read both, and I want to tell you that there are pitfalls with both. Let's talk about the pitfalls of writing historical fiction. Number one, you need to craft a story. You need to say, why am I reading this? Why am I writing this? Am I bored while writing this? Am I bored while reading this? Because if the answer to any of those questions is, yes, I'm bored, I don't know why I'm writing this, then you're going to fall under the general idea of what historical fiction novels tend to fall under, which is so much attention to detail that you lose your narrative. Okay? One of the Shera books in the Western series, I think it's the third one, spent so much time on detail that the narrative that was actually quite compelling in the first third goes away. And you're more apt to understand the setting instead of the characters. The characters are what drive the story. Without compelling characters, there's no reason to read. I say this kind of, because of the Amazon show, but I decided to reread The Silmarillion. It's a tough read because it's mainly a history book, so you don't have one or two or three even characters that are pushing you throughout the whole narrative. It really is just a chronicle of events. And that's also what sometimes happens with historical fiction when they're using real characters to push forward your narrative. A few years ago, I read a book about Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, and Mary Read. And while a great deal of that book had its factual accuracies, the inaccuracies were actually what made the book compelling to read. It took the lives of those three pirates, and they added in another pirate as well that didn't exist, and they turned their story into a swashbuckling romance. Think old 1920s, 1930s Errol Flynn style movies. And it had that level of drama that was perfect. When I'm reading historical fiction that wants to historicize, and I'm not sure if that's a word. I don't think that's a word. Historicize. But they want to do that to an event. But they're introducing us to a character that is going to have one chapter and then gone. There is no point. I talked about this in my Light of the Jedi review. We're getting a little off topic with the genre fiction stuff. But in the Light of the Jedi, the entire first fifth or first quarter of it, you are introduced to characters that you will never see again. And the book tries to create a backstory for each of these characters who are going to die within the next page. That does happen with a lot of historical fiction. Books about Normandy often land with this because so much was going on during the landing of Normandy, that this use of real people and real commanders, real historical figures, often falls into a lack of interest. And that's tricky. Now, what's the pitfall of something like Bernard Cornwell's series, and using a character to interact with a created character to interact with historical events? And I'm going to use Last Kingdom here because I've read a decent amount of the series. I was trying to read the books as I was watching the seasons. But what was happening is you have now introduced Uhtred, son of Uhtred, who wants Bebbanburg back. That's the entire crux of the Last Kingdom series. To King Alfred the Great. And the things that the two of them accomplish, you look at the history of it and you wonder, okay, so at the end of season 1 at the battle, Uhtred is, I wouldn't say pivotal, but he was very important in making sure that battle was a success. And when you look at the actual history of it, you try to find where Cornwell would have put that character and what is he emulating that character. And it's very hard because sometimes you want to have your created character, experience everything that's happened in this era of history to try to move the plot forward. So that's the pitfall there. Sometimes your created character takes the spot of an actual historical figure, and when you look at the history, the created character's insertion into that event makes no sense with the history. But that's, of course, when we talk about separating the fiction from the reality of the historical event. Now, what are some of the positives of writing historical fiction when you're using actual historical people as your main characters of the narrative? Your Shera's, that book about the pirates I was telling you about. I have to understand that the choice of the characters made in these books was done methodically and for a reason. And it is fairly true. So in the first book in the series, Gods and Generals, there is more of a Confederate-sided view to it, because in this first part, at least Civil War in the East, American Civil War in the East, the South had the upper hand. Then you get to the Killer Angels, which is the Battle of Gettysburg, and that pretty much is the turning point for the Civil War in the East. And then you have The Last Full Measure. That book is mainly focused on Union command sweeping up and ending the war. Now, when you read all three of those as a whole, you get a good idea of the Civil War of the East. So these characters that are being chosen for a reason, and that is to create the broader narrative of what's going on. When you finish reading Gods and Generals, you kind of get this feeling like you're not sure what the story was, but the story was history. And, you know, all the research that goes into who these people are, it's a lot of work, but it is also very rewarding. When you read a book like this and you have no knowledge of that, sometimes you learn a thing or two and it spurs an interest in you that you go and look further into it. I've heard people say, you really shouldn't read historical fiction novels because it's not good for you. You'll never learn anything. I disagree. If something is interesting to you enough, you will go and learn more about what happened there. Most people understand that these books are fiction. So I would hope that you would further your interest in it. Now, the positive about having a book, a historical fiction book, where your main character is a creation and then they are kind of swirling themselves around the historical events, is that you actually get to create a plot and a character for your main character. It's hard to create characters for people who lived through historic events, especially when it's a well-documented historical event like the American Civil War. But when you're talking about a character you've created, you get to have character development. You have these subplots of what they want to do. Why are they doing what they need to do? What is the point of having them connected with this historical figure? What is the point of having them connected with that one? What is going to be the pitfall when the bad things happen that you know are going to happen to that historical figure that they're attached to? Things like that. That's part of the positive about writing a book, historical fiction book, where you are creating something. Both have their merits. Now, it is interesting when talking about the broader subject of historical fiction as a piece of genre fiction, is that I think, still to this day, it's the only piece of genre fiction that exists in the fiction section in your bookstore. So when you go to the bookstore and take a look, you'll notice that there's fiction and nonfiction, right? Okay. But mainly nonfiction is separated into its many different things like history, cooking, travel, science, mathematics, your crossword puzzle section. So nonfiction is endless as far as what you're looking for. But when you're looking for a work of fiction, you can go to the fiction section, right? Okay. But when you're done in the fiction section and you wanted to find some Tolkien, all right, you have to go to the sci-fi/fantasy section. Thankfully, they are separating a lot of those nowadays. So there's what I would consider genre fictions: historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance. Sometimes you get adventure in there, but those books are harder and harder to find. Those are more pulpy types of things that you'll find out there. So there's the 5 that I consider to be the genre fictions. You also have your graphic novels, you have your manga, you have, I think that's it actually. But out of all the genre fictions, historical fiction gets a pass, and a lot of people wonder why. Now, I think it's because the definition of fiction is a fictional story of people in a certain era. And that's really what historical fiction is. It's a story about someone in a certain era, be it modern or historical. And that's why these tend to slide into the fiction section. What's interesting is that in a horror section, you'll find Stephen King books. Not all Stephen King books are horror, but Stephen King also made it into the standard fiction section. So anyway, those are my thoughts considering historical fiction. It is, believe it or not, an intensely difficult, depending on your era, genre to write, because you need to make sure that a lot of your facts are correct, and the facts that you bend are bendable enough to meet your plot. So, next week we're going to talk about fantasy, which is the genre that I write in, and what makes certain types of fantasy, what makes different types of fantasy. So, that's going to be it. Like I said, historical fiction here, and the 2 books I use, for example, we have Gods and Generals, or I just say the entire Sheriff Civil War trilogy and Western books, and then Bernard Cornwell, his entire catalog is full of historical fiction books with all of his series. I can't speak for some of the others, where most of his characters have been created. See you next time, everybody, and if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. It helps the channel out, and we'll see you next time. Bye.